Good afternoon, everybody. The first thing to say is that I'll be speaking on behalf of Europe's energy regulators. And so the one thing that energy regulators are not responsible for, although in the discussion I hear regulators seem to be responsible for an awful lot, but one thing we're not responsible for is permitting. And that's a major topic of this energy package. And whilst I think it's fair to say that energy regulators recognise very well that one of the major delays we find to the development of new infrastructure is the challenge of permitting, and we support the proposal to try and streamline that. But we are not responsible for that. So I am going to focus very much on how we pay and allocate the costs for new energy infrastructure. And I'd like to start by talking a little bit about how energy infrastructure is paid for traditionally in the past. Normally what happens is that energy infrastructure is paid for by people like you and I, customers who pay their bills. That money goes into network tariffs, and the tariffs are collected and help to pay for the costs of the infrastructure. Infrastructure lasts for a very long time, and that gives a lot of security to investors that infrastructure is going to be paid for, and the investors expect a fair return. The mechanism is quite straightforward. The investment is made. The money goes into the regulatory asset base of the company, and there is a rate of return that the company can get, which is a fair rate of return. We always argue about what rate is fair. Normally the investors want the rate to be higher and regulators want the rate to be lower. But we come to an agreement, and that money is then collected through tariffs. And that approach has worked well. We have a lot of infrastructure. However, today the challenges we face are rather different. There are new challenges. We need to deal with issues of the huge investments we need to deal with climate change, new issues, new challenges relating to security of energy supply in Europe, and even other issues. And we've heard that cohesion, avoiding isolation of energy systems, is another priority we need to tackle. And the question is, are the old mechanisms adequate to do that? And I think the general view is that the answer is that they're not, and perhaps we need to think again about how we do this. And so the European regulators very much welcome the proposals in the energy infrastructure package. There are some things we'd like to see clarified, some things we'd like to see improved, of course, as many people do. And Mr. de Campos, you have our list of amendments we're proposing, which I think is probably waiting for you on your return. But we think that this is a good package, and we very much welcome it. So in the future, how do we deal with the fact that investments need to be made? And some of those investments are perhaps cross-border. And those investments are not just about trying to improve the competitiveness of our economy, trying to get prices down. Some of them are aimed at tackling climate change, security supply, cohesion. Who should pay? Well, when we look at that, the view of regulators is that the beneficiary of this new investment should pay. So if you're in an area where prices fall or don't go up as much because a new piece of infrastructure has been built, then in our view, you should be among the group that help to pay for that infrastructure. And the reality of that is that now we're heading towards a single European market, that if you're in one country, but the infrastructure happens to be in another, but nevertheless you are the beneficiary, then there has to be a mechanism so that you pay for it rather than the tariff payers in the country where the infrastructure is built. That's, I think, relatively straightforward. Perhaps slightly more complicated is this issue of, well, if you get an enhancement in security of supply by building infrastructure, maybe because you have more diverse resources, more gas storage, or new access to different sources of generation because new wires and pipes have been built, then you again, if you are the beneficiary of that benefit, then you should pay. The difficulty here, of course, is that we will do a cost-benefit analysis, and as the previous speaker said, a cost-benefit analysis is a mechanism to determine what the benefits might be and who should receive them. The fact is, it's very complicated. And in determining who benefits from security of supply, it actually gets quite difficult to work out who the beneficiaries are and who should pay. But overall, maybe still feasible to do that. And of course, there are other benefits as well, which we might see. Some of these benefits are, and perhaps a large one, is about tackling climate change. And there are interesting questions here about who should pay for saved carbon. Who should pay for the fact that we're investing a lot of money potentially in infrastructure with the intention of saving carbon? And there is an argument that I put on this slide that says, well, actually, all of Europe's consumers benefit from saved carbon. And so perhaps all of Europe's consumers should pay. So all of these different aspects of who's the beneficiary become increasingly complex as we go through the list of goals that we have for the development of infrastructure. And we have to work through this very carefully in determining who fairly should pay these costs. Well, these costs, of course, end up going through into prices. There is a role for regulators here. Because where we have an investment which is aimed at, which is perhaps the best way of providing energy to a particular region, so you put in some wires rather than building a new generation plant because that's the cheapest way forward, what you've achieved is something where you're supplying energy at a lower cost than any alternative, and clearly that helps to keep prices down. But overall, we've got other goals here, and we see that while we are investing in infrastructure to address issues of climate change, security of supply, overall, enhancing the quality of these services will come at a cost. And what we as regulators want to do is to try and ensure that the money that's invested is invested as efficiently as possible. And that is the core business of a regulator, which is to ensure that the people who are investing the money are quite clear that they have to take decisions on that investment so the investment is done efficiently, so that in the long run, the costs to consumers and the competitiveness of Europe is minimized. And so clearly there's a role here for regulators, and we think that regulators should have a clear remit to do that throughout the life cycle of the investment, right up to the point where the investments are completed. So that's an important role, I think, for regulators in terms of investments. But looking at the other side of the coin, of course, investors want certainty. What investors want, and it's interesting, we heard this in the last session, investors want to keep the return as high as they reasonably can, and they want naturally to reduce the amount of risk that they face. That's entirely normal. It's called protecting shareholders' interests. It's perfectly legitimate. But regulators here have a role of trying to ensure that no unnecessary risks are imposed. And a sound regulatory framework can help to eliminate unnecessary risks to investors. And what we think in terms of the selection of projects of common interest, and indeed in determining whether projects should receive additional European Union financial support, is that we need very clear criteria about which projects are eligible and which projects are not. And I think I can't overstate this point, because if we fail to make sure that this criteria are very clear, then inevitably investors will want to try to see if their own project is eligible for support, to see whether their project can, the risks that they face in their project can be passed on to others. And in those circumstances, we will see delay in viable, good projects which should simply be pushed forward and should become a reality very quickly. So if we get this area wrong, we unfortunately might find we have delay, where really what we want to do is to accelerate investments. Of course, a clear way of doing this is to have a sound cost-benefit analysis, and that's something which is extremely important. We also, on the right occasions, need to have appropriate regulatory incentives for the right projects. Now, regulatory incentives are good at encouraging investors to do things that either they wouldn't do, or to do things more quickly than they otherwise would do. But incentives are very much focused and need to be tailored on individual projects. They need to address the specific risks that individual projects face. And so here we think that we support the idea of incentives, and we think they should be used on the right projects at the right time and be tailored to the needs of those projects. So the role of regulators. First of all, just to remind you, it's not permitting. But the role of regulators is, first of all, to ensure that there is clarity in the criteria that's used to select projects of common interest, and also clarity in determining which projects should receive European Union funding or should be eligible for European funding. We think that the cost allocation methodologies are something where regulators have a big role to play, and I think regulators are willing to step up to the mark to deliver that. The last point here is that we should make sure that regulators inadvertently are not prevented from ensuring that throughout the lifetime of the investment that they can ensure that costs that are incurred are efficiently incurred in order to keep costs down and to ensure that prices don't go up beyond that which is essential to achieve Europe's energy goals. Thank you very much.